July 6, 1988. 10:50 p.m. 229 men realized simultaneously that every safety shortcut, every ignored procedure, every laughed-off warning had led to this single moment. Standing on a platform that had become a vertical funeral pyre surrounded by burning ocean, with exactly one choice. Jump 175 feet into flaming water or burn alive where they stood. The permit that should have saved them was sitting in a drawer. The firewall that should have protected them had holes cut through it for cables. The escape routes that should have been clear were blocked by locked doors. And the man who had warned them, Red Adair's safety engineer Bob Valentine, whose memos about the permit to work system gathered dust in management files, watched from Aberdeen as the entire North Sea horizon turned orange, vindicated in the worst possible way. If you're interested in stories about institutional failure and human survival, hit that like button. We're just getting started. The Piper Alpha platform sat 120 miles northeast of Aberdeen, Scotland. A steel city rising from the North Sea, processing oil and gas from multiple platforms across the Piper field. By 1988, it was the world's single largest oil producer. $317 million in annual revenue flowing through pipes and pumps that were, by that summer, badly aging. The platform employed 226 workers on rotating shifts, plus 3 workers from a separate diving support vessel. Most were Scottish. Many from Aberdeen and the surrounding communities. They worked 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. 12-hour shifts in conditions that ranged from merely uncomfortable to actively hostile. Among them was Barry Barber, a 38-year-old scaffolder from Fraserburgh. Father of 3. 15 years offshore experience. His wife Linda later testified that he'd mentioned safety concerns in phone calls home. The place is held together with duct tape and prayers, he told her in May. But the money's good and the North Sea's hiring freezes are coming. Barry was working the night shift on July 6. He never came home. Also on the platform that night was Robert Vernon, a 29-year-old roustabout. First offshore job. 3 months into his career. His mother Margaret told the Cullen Inquiry he'd been excited about the work, proud of the paycheck, planning to propose to his girlfriend when his rotation ended. Robert jumped from the helideck at 11:06 p.m. He survived the fall. He drowned in burning oil before rescue boats could reach him. His body was never recovered. What made Piper Alpha different from other North Sea platforms was its evolution. Originally designed in 1973 as an oil-only platform, it had been converted in 1980 to also handle gas. But the conversion was never complete. Never properly integrated. The gas compression modules were bolted onto a structure designed for different purposes. The original platform had 2 main modules, the drilling module and the production module. When gas processing was added, 2 massive compression modules were installed on the north end. Module C and Module D, each containing gas compresses the size of buses, processing gas at pressures exceeding 1400 psi. The problem? These modules were connected to the original structure through a pipe rack that ran directly beneath the accommodation quarters. If that pipe rack failed, burning gas would flow directly under where men slept. Several engineers raised concerns during the conversion design phase. Their memos, recovered during the inquiry, were explicit. Current layout creates unacceptable fire risk to accommodation areas. Recommend relocating pipe rack or implementing additional firewall protection. The recommendation was rejected as too expensive. The engineers were told the existing firewall between production and accommodation modules was adequate. That firewall, as we'll discover, was anything but. The man who understood this better than anyone was Bob Valentine. Valentine had worked offshore for Red Adair's company, the legendary oil well firefighting operation. He'd seen what happened when safety became secondary to production. He'd watched men die because someone took a shortcut. By 1987, he was working as a safety consultant, reviewing North Sea platforms for compliance and risk assessment. When he reviewed Piper Alpha's permit to work system in September 1987, he wrote a memo that should have changed everything. The permit to work system was simple in theory. Before any maintenance work began, a permit was issued. That permit documented exactly what was being done. What equipment was isolated? What safety measures were in place? When work stopped for any reason, the permit documented that too. Crucially, before anyone could restart that equipment, they had to check the permit system to ensure no maintenance was ongoing. In practice, on Piper Alpha, the system had collapsed into administrative theater. Valentine's memo was blunt. The current permit system creates confusion rather than safety. Multiple shifts handling different permits on the same equipment without adequate handover. Supervisors signing off on work they haven't personally inspected. Critical safety information not being communicated between day and night crews. The permit board in the control room is disorganized and incomplete. I observed 3 separate instances during my 2-day visit where permits were not properly closed out after work completion. I observed 2 instances where equipment was restarted without verification that maintenance had concluded. This system will eventually cause a serious incident. The memo went to Occidental Petroleum's management in Aberdeen. It was filed. No changes were made. But the problems Valentine identified weren't isolated to permits. They were symptoms of a broader cultural rot. In March 1988, 4 months before the disaster, a gas leak occurred on the platform. Not a small leak. A significant release from a corroded pipe fitting in Module C. The leak triggered gas alarms and required emergency shutdown procedures. The incident report, filed by the platform's safety officer, recommended immediate inspection of all pipe fittings in the gas compression modules and implementation of enhanced corrosion monitoring. Occidental's response: defer the inspections until the next scheduled maintenance shutdown. 6 months away. The safety officer protested in writing. Deferring this inspection creates unacceptable risk. The corrosion patterns suggest systemic issues throughout the gas system. His protest was noted and filed. The inspections were not conducted. In May, another incident. A pressure relief valve on one of the condensate pumps failed to operate correctly during a routine test. The valve was supposed to automatically release pressure if it exceeded safe limits. Instead, it stuck partially open, creating a leak, then stuck closed when pressure built again. The maintenance supervisor recommended replacing all pressure relief valves in the condensate system as a precautionary measure. The valves were original equipment, 15 years old, showing signs of wear and corrosion. Occidental approved replacement of the failed valve only. Replacing all valves would require taking pumps offline, reducing production capacity. The maintenance supervisor's recommendation was filed. The other valves remained in service. One of those old valves was on pump A. The pump that would be under maintenance on July 6. The pump whose pressure relief valve was being removed and replaced that day. The pump with a 6-inch hole sealed by a temporary flange not rated for full pressure. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's understand exactly what Piper Alpha was processing and why it was so dangerous. The platform handled both oil and gas, but by 1988, it was primarily a gas processing facility. Gas from the Piper, Claymore, and Tartan fields flowed to Piper Alpha through underwater pipelines. On the platform, the gas went through several stages. First, separation. The gas arrived mixed with liquid condensate, essentially very light oil. Separators removed most of this liquid. Second, compression. The gas was compressed to high pressure for transport to shore through the main gas export pipeline. This compression happened in those massive Module C and Module D compressors. Third, condensate handling. The liquid condensate removed during separation had to be pumped away. This was the job of Pump A and Pump B. These pumps pushed condensate into a separate pipeline for processing. The condensate itself was dangerous. It was a mixture of light hydrocarbons, propane, butane, pentane. Extremely volatile. At normal atmospheric pressure, it vaporized immediately. Under pressure in the pump system, it remained liquid. But if that pressure was lost, through a leak, for instance, the liquid would flash into gas. A lot of gas. Very quickly. The engineering calculations done after the disaster determined that if Pump A's 6-inch opening released condensate at 145 psi, the resulting gas cloud would form at a rate of approximately 30 tons per minute. 30 tons of explosive hydrocarbon gas per minute. Heavier than air, so it would sink and spread across the platform deck. Invisible. Waiting for ignition. The gas detection system was supposed to prevent this scenario. Sensors throughout the platform monitored for hydrocarbon presence. If gas was detected, alarms sounded. If concentrations reached dangerous levels, automatic emergency shutdowns would activate, isolating the source and preventing ignition. In theory. In practice, the gas detection system on Piper Alpha had been degraded by years of inadequate maintenance and deliberate modifications. A 1987 audit, conducted by an independent safety consultant, found that 43% of gas detectors were either non-functional or operating outside calibration specifications. The audit recommended immediate replacement and implementation of rigorous testing schedules. Occidental's response was to replace the most critically failed detectors and implement monthly testing. But monthly testing wasn't happening. The testing schedule required taking areas offline, which impacted production. So tests were deferred, delayed, eventually abandoned except for annual certifications. By July 1988, nobody knew exactly how many gas detectors were actually working. Meanwhile, the emergency shutdown system, the ESDs in industry terminology, had been systematically compromised. ESDs were designed to fail safe. If sensors detected gas, if pressure exceeded limits, if fire was detected, the system would automatically shut down equipment, close valves, isolate dangerous systems. This happened automatically. No human intervention required. But automatic shutdowns cost money. Every time the ESD system activated, production stopped. Sometimes for hours while systems were inspected and restarted. Sometimes for days if the shutdown revealed underlying problems. Occidental's production targets were aggressive. Platform managers were evaluated on production output. Bonuses were tied to minimizing downtime. So the ESD system was modified. Not officially. Not through formal engineering change procedures. But through a process called temporary bridging. When a sensor triggered nuisance shutdowns, alarms from faulty detectors, for instance, technicians would temporarily bridge the sensor, essentially bypassing it in the ESD logic. The sensor might still alarm, but it wouldn't trigger automatic shutdowns. These temporary bridges were supposed to be removed once the underlying issue was fixed. In practice, they became permanent. Over Piper Alpha's operational life, more than 100 such bridges were installed. By July 1988, the ESD system was a Swiss cheese of bypasses and modifications. Large sections of the platform's safety shutdowns existed only on paper. The actual automated response capability had been quietly eliminated. An engineer who worked on Piper Alpha in 1986 testified anonymously to the Cullen inquiry. His testimony was damning. "We all knew the ESD system wasn't really functional. Not the way it was designed. You'd see a gas alarm and nothing would happen. No shutdown. Just the alarm. Someone would call the control room and they'd say, 'Yeah, we know, that sense is bridged out.' It became normalized. Nobody questioned it because questioning it meant admitting we were operating outside our safety case." The safety case. That was the regulatory document filed with the UK Department of Energy certifying that the platform was safe to operate. The safety case described extensive ESD capabilities, rigorous maintenance schedules, functional safety systems. The reality on the platform bore little resemblance to the safety case's descriptions. But audits were infrequent. Regulators accepted documentation at face value. And Occidental had no incentive to reveal the gap between what they'd certified and what actually existed. So when July 6, 1988 arrived, Piper Alpha was a disaster waiting for a trigger. Inadequate permit systems. Degraded gas detection. Compromised emergency shutdowns. Aging equipment. Production pressure overriding safety concerns. All it needed was one mistake. July 6 started as a routine day on Piper Alpha. The morning shift began at 6 a.m. Among the work scheduled that day was maintenance on Pump A, one of two condensate pumps. The pump needed a pressure safety valve replaced. This was the same valve that had been flagged in May as aging and potentially unreliable. The maintenance crew consisted of 3 technicians led by a supervisor named Michael Jennings. Jennings had worked offshore for 12 years. Experienced. Careful. The kind of supervisor who checked his team's work personally. The valve replacement should have been straightforward. Isolate the pump. Depressurize the system. Remove the old valve. Install the new one. Pressure test. Return to service. 6 hours of work, maybe 8. But when Jennings' team opened up the pump, they discovered the valve was more corroded than expected. The mounting flange was damaged. The threads were partially stripped. Simply replacing the valve wouldn't be enough. They needed to remove the entire valve assembly, inspect the pump casing, possibly machine new threads. This wasn't a 6-hour job anymore. This was at least 12 hours, maybe 16. The work wouldn't finish during the day shift. Jennings filled out the permit documenting the work. Pump are isolated. Condensate system depressurized. Pressure safety valve removed. 6-inch opening in pump casing temporarily sealed with blind flange. The blind flange was tightened to hand-tight specifications, enough to keep it sealed while work continued, but not rated for the full operational pressure of 145 psi. The permit explicitly stated, "Pump are not to be started until valve replacement complete and pressure test passed." Jennings signed the permit. His supervisor signed it. The control room operator received a copy. By 6 p.m., when the day shift ended, the work wasn't complete. The new valve assembly hadn't arrived from the warehouse. Jennings' team secured the worksite, confirmed the blind flange was in place, and prepared for shift handover. The shift handover briefing mentioned that Pump A was down for maintenance. The permit was supposed to be in the active permit board in the control room. This was the system's critical function, ensuring everyone knew what equipment was under maintenance and couldn't be operated. But here's where the degraded permit system failed its first critical test. The control room had multiple permit boards. One for electrical work. One for mechanical work. One for hot work. The mechanical permit board, where Pump A's permit belonged, was crowded with old permits that hadn't been properly closed out. Some dated back weeks. The board was effectively useless for its intended purpose. So Jennings placed the Pump A permit in the control room supervisor's desk drawer. He told the shift supervisor. The supervisor acknowledged. Then the day shift went home. The night shift arrived. Different supervisor. Different crew. The handover briefing was rushed. The day shift was tired and wanted to leave. The night shift was just arriving, not fully focused yet. The briefing mentioned that Pump A was down. What it didn't clearly communicate was the specific reason. That the pressure safety valve was removed. That there was a 6-inch hole in the pump system sealed only by a hand-tight blind flange. That starting the pump would be catastrophic. The night shift supervisor, a man named Thomas Kent, made a note that Pump A was unavailable. He didn't ask for details. He didn't check the permit board, which wouldn't have helped anyway since the permit wasn't there. He assumed Pump A would be down for routine maintenance and would be available the next day. Thomas Kent had been with Occidental for 9 years. A good supervisor. Conscientious. But he was operating within a broken system that had trained him to accept incomplete information as normal. Meanwhile, the permit for Pump A sat in a desk drawer. Out of sight. Out of mind. Waiting to be forgotten. The night shift settled into routine. In the galley, catering supervisor Jeff Bollins and his team prepared dinner service. Bollins was 52, from Aberdeen, a career offshore catering professional. He'd worked on 7 different platforms over 23 years. Piper Alpha was, he told his wife, probably his last posting before retirement. On the production deck, operators monitored the complex system of pumps, compressors, separators, and pipelines that kept oil and gas flowing. The control room had 3 operators on duty. Lead operator Bob Carroll, assistant operator Andrew Killer, and trainee operator Stephen Macbeth. Bob Carroll was 46. Married. 2 daughters in university. He'd been lead control room operator on Piper Alpha for 5 years. His job was to monitor all platform systems, respond to alarms, coordinate with other platforms, manage the complex dance of pressures and flows that kept everything running. He was extraordinarily good at his job. His personnel file, reviewed during the inquiry, was filled with commendations. Outstanding technical knowledge. Calm under pressure. Takes personal responsibility for safety. Bob Carroll would die at his post. But before he died, he would save dozens of lives through decisions made in impossible circumstances. At 9:45 p.m., Pump B failed unexpectedly. The pump had been running normally. No warning signs. Then suddenly, bearing failure. A catastrophic mechanical breakdown that seized the pump motor. In the control room, alarms began sounding. Pump B offline. Condensate backing up in the separator system. Pressure building. Carroll immediately understood the implications. Without a functioning condensate pump, liquid would accumulate in the gas separators. If liquid levels got too high, the separators would automatically shut down. If the separators shut down, gas processing stopped. If Piper Alpha stopped processing gas, the other platforms sending gas to Piper would have to shut down too. Claymore platform. Tartan platform. MCP-01. All feeding gas to Piper Alpha for processing. All would have to cease production. The financial impact: hundreds of thousands of pounds per hour in lost production. Carroll had been through this scenario before. The procedure was clear. If one condensate pump failed, you started the backup pump. Piper Alpha had 2 pumps precisely for this redundancy. He turned to Andrew Killer. Start pump A. Killer was a competent operator. 28 years old. 4 years on Piper Alpha. He knew the procedure. Before starting any equipment, you checked the permit board to ensure no maintenance was ongoing. He checked the mechanical permit board. The board was a mess of old permits. He scanned for pump A. He didn't see a current permit. The permit that Jennings had filled out, the one that explicitly said, "Pump are not to be started," was in a desk drawer. Killer made a decision that thousands of operators had made before him on platforms across the North Sea. He assumed that if there was a serious issue, there would be a clear permit on the board. Since he didn't see one, he assumed pump A was available. He asked a colleague, "Is pump A available?" The colleague, who'd been at the shift briefing where pump A was mentioned as down, said, "I thought it was, let me check." He checked the permit board. Same result. No clear current permit. "I don't see any reason we can't start it." This was the moment. The exact failure point that Valentine had warned about in his September 1987 memo. Inadequate permit communication between shifts. Critical safety information not being conveyed. A system degraded to the point where operators were guessing about equipment status. At 9:53 p.m., Andrew Killer pressed the start button for pump A. For several minutes, nothing seemed wrong. The pump began operating. The motor spun up. Condensate started flowing from the separators through the pump system. Pressure stabilized. The alarms quieted. In the control room, Carroll relaxed slightly. Crisis averted. Production continuing. He made a note to have pump B inspected first thing in the morning. Meanwhile, in the pump module, condensate under 145 psi of pressure was flowing toward that 6-inch opening sealed only with a hand-tight blind flange. The flange held for approximately 90 seconds. Then the pressure overcame the inadequate seal. The flange began leaking. Not catastrophically. Just a small spray at first. Condensate jetting out around the flange edges. Immediately vaporizing into gas as it hit atmospheric pressure. The leak intensified rapidly. The pressure behind the flange was pushing. The hand-tight bolts weren't designed for this stress. One bolt sheared. Then another. At 9:55 p.m. and 27 seconds, the blind flange blew off completely. 6 inches of opening. Condensate at 145 pounds per square inch. Instantly vaporizing into gas. The subsequent engineering analysis calculated the release rate at approximately 30 tons of hydrocarbon gas per minute. A massive invisible cloud erupted into the pump module. Heavier than air. Spreading across the deck. Flowing into low areas. Accumulating. The gas detection system should have alarmed immediately. But remember the 43% failure rate from the 1987 audit? The inadequate maintenance? The degraded calibration? The gas detector nearest to pump A was one of the non-functional units. The cloud continued growing. In the control room, no alarms. No indication anything was wrong. Carroll and his team continued their work, unaware that below them, an explosive cloud was forming. 60 seconds after the flange blew off, a functional gas detector finally registered the cloud. The alarm sounded in the control room. High-level gas detection. Pump module. Carol looked at the alarm panel. Gas detected. But which detector? How serious? The display system was ambiguous, a result of the modifications and bypasses installed over the years. He initiated standard procedure. Call the pump module. Investigate the alarm. Prepare for possible shutdown. But there wasn't time. The gas cloud had been spreading for nearly 90 seconds. It had reached the edges of the pump module. It was flowing into adjacent areas. Seeking ignition. At 9:58 p.m. and 43 seconds, it found one. The ignition source was never definitively identified. The subsequent investigation listed several possibilities. An electrical junction box. A motor housing. A hot surface on operating equipment. The gas cloud was so extensive that multiple ignition sources were simultaneously available. What's certain is the result. The explosion was instantaneous. 30 tons of vaporized hydrocarbon igniting in a confined space. The overpressure wave exceeded specifications for the platform's blast walls. The explosion was heard in Aberdeen, 120 miles away. Seismographs in Scotland and Norway recorded the shock. On the platform, the effects were immediate and devastating. The pump module disintegrated. The blast wave propagated outward in all directions. The firewall between the production modules and the accommodation module, the wall that was supposed to protect the areas where men lived, failed catastrophically. Remember those holes cut for cables and pipes? Those unsealed penetrations? The blast wave channeled through them like water through a broken dam. The firewall, instead of stopping the explosion, directed it straight into the accommodation areas. The pipe rack running beneath the accommodation module, the one that engineers had warned about during the gas conversion, was torn apart. Pipes ruptured, including the main oil pipeline from the Tartan and Claymore platforms. That pipeline carried crude oil at 300 degrees Fahrenheit under high pressure. Normally, if Piper Alpha had an emergency, the other platforms would detect it and automatically shut down the pipelines, stopping the flow of oil. But Piper Alpha's emergency communication systems were destroyed in the first seconds of the explosion. No shutdown signal was sent to Tartan and Claymore. Hot oil under pressure began spraying directly into the heart of the fire. Within 2 minutes, Piper Alpha had become a 230-foot tall vertical furnace visible from Aberdeen. Jeff Bollins was in the galley cleaning up after dinner service. He survived to give testimony at the Cullen inquiry. His words, delivered in flat, traumatized monotone, painted the picture. The first explosion threw me across the room. It wasn't like the movies. No fireball rolling through. Just a massive bang, and suddenly I was on the floor with my ears ringing. The lights went out immediately. Emergency lighting came on, but it was dim, inadequate. I could hear screaming. Then the heat hit. Not gradual. Instant. Like opening an oven door, except it was everywhere. The walls were hot to touch within seconds. Paint was bubbling. Plastic fixtures were melting. I knew we had to get out immediately or we'd all die. Bollins gathered the 6 galley workers who were still conscious. The explosion had injured 2 seriously. One man, the assistant cook, had been thrown into a steel counter and couldn't stand. Another had been hit by falling equipment and was bleeding from a head wound. They tried the normal exit route from the galley. The door opened to a corridor filled with thick black smoke and flames. Impassable. They tried the emergency exit. The door was jammed. The explosion's force had warped the frame. 3 men together couldn't force it open. Bollins made a decision. We went to the cold store. The big refrigerated room where we kept meat and vegetables. It was the only place I could think of that might protect us from the heat. We got everyone inside, closed the door, and waited, hoping someone would rescue us before we either froze to death or the fire melted through the walls. 7 men huddled in a refrigerated room. Outside, the platform burned. Inside, the temperature dropped. They had no communications. No way to signal for help. No idea if rescue was even possible. Bollins continued. We lasted maybe 30 minutes before the cold became unbearable. One of the injured men was going into shock. I made the decision to leave the cold store and try to find another route out. When we opened the door, the corridor was worse. The smoke was thicker. We could see flames through gaps in the walls. But we couldn't stay. So we went. What Bollins didn't know was that he was leading his group toward one of the few remaining escape routes that hadn't been cut off by fire or structural collapse. Blind luck. He turned left when turning right would have led them into an inferno. He chose a stairwell that was still mostly clear when the adjacent stairwell was engulfed. We made it to the lower deck. I could see the ocean. I could see boats. The silver pit was there, close to the platform. Men on the deck waving at us. But there was no way down. The normal access ladders were gone. Melted or collapsed. We were trapped on a ledge about 40 feet above the water. The crew of the silver pit, a rescue and standby vessel, had arrived at the platform within 10 minutes of the explosion. Captain Mike Jennings, no relation to the maintenance supervisor, brought his vessel as close as he dared. The heat was so intense it was blistering paint on the ship's superstructure. Captain Jennings later testified. We could see men on the platform. Waving. Shouting. We could barely hear them over the roar of the fire. We tried to get closer but the heat was overwhelming. Our deck crew were backing away from the side because the radiant heat was burning exposed skin. We were 100 feet away and it felt like standing in front of a blast furnace. One of the Silver Pit's crew members, a 23-year-old deckhand named James McLeod, made a decision that saved Bollins and his group. I grabbed a rope. Tied it to the rail. Threw it toward the platform. The first throw fell short. The second throw reached. I saw a man on the platform grab it. Then I just held on and prayed. Bollins again. The rope landed near us. I grabbed it. I knew we had maybe one chance. I sent the injured men first. One at a time. Hand over hand down the rope to the water. Then swimming to the ship. The ship's crew were pulling him out. I went last. By the time I hit the water, my hands were raw from the rope. The water was covered in oil but it wasn't burning where we were. I swam maybe 20 feet. Hands grabbed me. Pulled me onto the ship's deck. I looked back at the platform and realized we'd escaped from hell. Bollins and all 6 galley workers survived. They were among the lucky ones. In the accommodation module, men who moments before had been watching television, writing letters home, or sleeping in their bunks now faced a nightmare scenario. The explosion had damaged or destroyed most escape routes. The primary stairwells were blocked by fire. The emergency muster station, where they'd trained to gather during drills, was inaccessible, engulfed in flames. Barry Barber, the scaffolder from Fraserburgh, was in his bunk when the explosion occurred. His roommate, a man named Colin Seaton, survived and testified about those first moments. The bang woke me instantly. The room was dark except for emergency lighting. Barry was already up, pulling on his boots. He said, "We need to move now." We opened the door and the corridor was filling with smoke. We could hear alarms, screaming, the roar of fire. We started toward the muster station. That's what you're trained to do. Muster station, wait for instruction. But when we turned the corner, we could see fire. The whole corridor was blocked. Barry said we needed to go up. Get to the helideck. That was the only high point left. Seaton and Barber joined a group of approximately 30 men making their way up through the accommodation module toward the helideck. The route was treacherous. Smoke reduced visibility to inches. Heat made every surface dangerous to touch. Men were coughing, disoriented, panicking. Barry took charge, Seaton said. He'd done rescue training. He knew you had to stay calm. He got everyone to link together, hold onto each other, move as a group. We felt our way through corridors. Some doors we tried were too hot to open. Others opened to reveal fire. We kept climbing. It felt like it took hours. It was probably 10 minutes. They reached the helideck at approximately 10:12 p.m. 47 men made it to the helideck. It was the highest point on the platform, normally used for helicopter landings. Open to the air. No roof. No protection. Below them, the platform was a sea of fire. The steel deck beneath their feet was heating up. Men were hopping from foot to foot as the heat penetrated their boots. Smoke was rising around them. The platform was groaning, the sound of metal under extreme stress. And there was no rescue coming. Helicopters couldn't land. The smoke and heat created massive updrafts. The deck itself was unstable. Radio communications were down. The men on the helideck were visible to rescue vessels, but unreachable. Robert Vernon, the 29-year-old roustabout on his first offshore job, was among the men on the helideck. A survivor who was standing near Vernon described the conversation. Robert was terrified. We all were. But he was shaking, crying. He said, "I can't jump. I can't do it." Someone told him we might not have to. Maybe rescue was coming. But we could all feel the heat increasing. The deck was getting hotter. We all knew the truth. We were going to have to jump or we were going to burn. Meanwhile, in the control room, Bob Carroll and his team were attempting to manage an impossible situation. The explosion had severed most of the platform's communications. Radio systems were damaged. Intercom systems were down. Carroll had no contact with shore. No contact with other platforms. No way to call for help or coordinate rescue. But he could still see his control panels. And what he saw was terrifying. The gas compression modules, Module C and Module D, were still operating. They were still pressurized. Still processing gas from the Tartan and Claymore platforms. And the fire was spreading toward them. If those modules exploded, everyone on the platform and everyone in the water would die instantly. The blast would be orders of magnitude larger than the initial explosion. Carroll made a decision. He and his team would stay in the control room and manually shut down the gas modules. They would isolate the gas flows. They would prevent the catastrophic secondary explosion. Andrew Killer, the assistant operator who had started Pump A, later gave testimony describing Carroll's leadership in those minutes. Bob knew we were going to die. You could see it in his face. The control room was surrounded by fire. The walls were hot. Equipment was sparking. But he said, "We need to give everyone else time to get off. If those gas modules blow before people can evacuate, everyone dies." He started going through shutdown procedures. Manually closing valves. Isolating systems. The computers were failing, but he knew the platform well enough to do it all manually. He sent me and Stephen to try to find an escape route. He stayed at the controls. Killer and trainee operator Stephen Macbeth left the control room at approximately 10:20 p.m. They made it as far as the external stairwell before smoke and fire forced them back. When they returned to the control room, Bob Carroll was still at the controls. He looked at us and said, "I thought I told you two to get out of here." We said there was no way out. He said, "Then we work." So we did. We kept shutting down systems. Closing valves. Trying to isolate the gas modules. We knew we were buying time. Maybe minutes. But every minute was people getting off the platform. At 10:37 p.m., the control room lost power. Emergency lighting failed. The control panels went dark. Carroll, Killer, and Macbeth continued working by feel in total darkness. At 10:52 p.m., 22 minutes after losing power, the Tartan platform's oil pipeline ruptured completely. The explosion killed everyone in the control room instantly. But their 57 minutes of work had successfully isolated most of the gas compression modules. When the modules did eventually fail, the explosion was contained. Not catastrophic. The fireball didn't engulf the entire platform. Men in the water survived who would have died if Carroll hadn't made the choice to stay. Bob Carroll's wife Ann testified at the Cullen inquiry. "They told me he stayed at his post. That he saved lives. I'm proud of him. But I'm also angry. He shouldn't have been in that position. The platform shouldn't have exploded. The safety system should have worked. Bob died being heroic because the company failed to be competent." Her testimony received a standing ovation. It was unprecedented in a public inquiry. On the helideck, the mathematics of survival had become unavoidable. The steel deck was now hot enough to burn through boot soles. Men were standing on life jackets, on clothing, on anything to insulate their feet from the heat. The platform was groaning louder. Structural supports were failing. The whole platform was tilting, destabilizing. Collapse was imminent. Charles Haggerty, a roughneck from Aberdeen, found himself at the edge of the helideck with 16 other men. He later testified about the decision process. "We were making our way toward what we thought was a lifeboat station. Then we turned a corner and there was just fire. A wall of it. We turned back. Another fire. We were trapped on the helideck edge. Below us was the sea. 175 feet down. Maybe more. The man next to me, Jamie, he'd been on the platform for 15 years. He looked at me and said, 'We have to jump.' I said, 'We'll die.' He said, 'We're already dead.' The survival training they'd all received had emphasized one absolute rule. Never jump from the platform. The height was too great. The water was too cold. Jumping was suicide. But that training had assumed rescue would be possible. That lifeboats would be accessible. That the platform would remain structurally sound during evacuation. None of those assumptions applied anymore. Jamie looked down at the water. It was covered in burning oil from the ruptured pipeline. Flames were spreading across the surface. But there were gaps. Areas where the oil hadn't reached yet. Windows of clear water. Jamie said, "Aim for the clear patches." Hit the water, go deep, swim underwater as far as you can. Come up away from the fire. Then he climbed over the rail. He looked back at us. He said, "I'll see you down there." And he jumped. Haggerty watched Jamie fall. The drop took approximately 3 seconds. Jamie hit the water feet first, arms at his sides. He disappeared beneath the surface. 5 seconds passed. 10. 15. Then Jamie surfaced. 100 feet from the platform. In a gap between burning oil patches. Swimming frantically. That's when I knew I had to do it. If I stayed, I was definitely going to die. If I jumped, I might die. But might is better than definitely. I climbed the rail. I looked down. I've never been more terrified in my life. Then I jumped. The fall was 3 seconds of pure terror. Haggerty remembered trying to keep his body straight. Trying to point his feet. Trying to prepare for impact. Hitting the water was like hitting concrete. I went deep. So deep I thought I'd never reach the surface. My lungs were burning. I was disoriented. I didn't know which way was up. Then I saw light above me and I swam for it. When I broke the surface, I was in the middle of burning oil. The water itself was on fire. I dove immediately. Swam underwater. My lungs were screaming. I surfaced. More fire. Dove again. I did that 3, maybe 4 times. Each time I surfaced, I was further from the platform. Finally, I came up and the fire was behind me. I could see a rescue boat, the Silver Pit, coming toward me. I just had to stay afloat. The Silver Pit's crew pulled Haggerty from the water at 11:07 p.m. He had been in the North Sea for 13 minutes. His core body temperature had dropped to 92 degrees. He was hypothermic, in shock, with compression injuries from the impact. But alive. Jamie, the man who jumped first, drowned. He surfaced after his jump, survivors saw him swimming, then he disappeared. His body was never recovered. Of the 17 men on that helideck edge, 5 made the jump. 3 survived the fall and the swim through burning oil. 2 drowned before rescue arrived. The remaining 12 men stayed on the helideck. All 12 died when the accommodation module collapsed at 11:23 p.m. Ed Punchard, a maintenance supervisor, was on a different part of the platform facing the same terrible choice. He was with a group of 32 men who'd made it to the upper level of the production module. They were trapped. Fire below them. Fire around them. The only clear space was straight down into the North Sea. Punchard had military training. He'd served in the Royal Marines. He'd done parachute training, water survival training. He understood terminal velocity, impact forces, survival angles. None of that training had prepared him for this. I knew the statistics, he later said. Jumping from that height, your survival chance is maybe 20%. Maybe. But staying was 0%. We were going to burn or the platform was going to collapse. Those were the only 2 options. I watched the first man jump. He hit wrong. Landed flat. He didn't come up. The second man hit better. He surfaced, started swimming. The third man missed the clear water. Hit an oil patch. Came up on fire. We could hear him screaming. Then he went under. I'll hear that scream until I die. Punchard made the jump at 11:04 p.m. I focused on technique. Feet together. Legs straight. Arms at sides. Chin tucked. I climbed the rail. I took a breath. And I stepped off. The fall felt like forever and no time at all. I remember watching the water rush up. Thinking, this is it. Then impact. I hit the water so hard I thought my legs were broken. I went deep. So deep. I couldn't tell which way was up. I just picked a direction and swam. When I surfaced, I was in clear water. I could see the Pharos, the firefighting support vessel, maybe 200 yards away. I started swimming toward it. I swam for my life. The Pharos was a specialized firefighting and rescue vessel designed specifically for North Sea oil disasters. It carried water cannons, firefighting equipment, and rescue craft. The vessel had rushed to Piper Alpha when the explosion was detected and arrived at approximately 10:30 p.m. The Pharos's crew performed 36 rescues that night. But it wasn't enough. Captain Mike Davis, commanding the Pharos, testified about the impossible situation his crew faced. We could see men in the water. We could see men on the platform. But we couldn't get close enough. The heat was melting our rescue equipment. We deployed our fast rescue craft, but the seas around the platform were covered in burning oil. The rescue craft couldn't navigate through it without catching fire. We watched men jump. We watched them surface. We watched them drown before we could reach them. It was the worst night of my life. We saved 36. We lost so many more. One rescue particularly haunted the Pharos crew. A man had jumped from the platform. Survived the fall. Surfaced in burning oil. Made it through to clear water. He was swimming toward the Pharos. Strong swimmer. Making good progress. The rescue craft was launched to intercept him. He was maybe 50 yards from the rescue boat, one crew member testified. We could see him clearly. We were shouting encouragement. He was waving. Then he just stopped. Stopped swimming. His arms went down. He floated for a moment. Then he sank. By the time the rescue boat reached his position, he was gone. Hypothermia probably. Or exhaustion. Or a heart attack from the stress. He was 50 yards from rescue and his body just gave up. The water temperature was 59 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, survival time before hypothermia-induced unconsciousness is approximately 1 to 2 hours for a fit adult. But that's under normal conditions. Men jumping from Piper Alpha were experiencing massive physical trauma from the fall, extreme stress, exertion from swimming through burning oil. Their survival times were dramatically shorter. Ed Punchard reached the Pharos at 11:18 p.m. He had been in the water for 14 minutes. He was pulled aboard unconscious. His core temperature was 91 degrees. He stopped breathing twice during resuscitation. The Pharos's medical crew saved his life. He woke up in a hospital in Aberdeen 2 days later. At 11:20 p.m., the Claymore platform's gas pipeline ruptured. This explosion was larger than the first two combined. The gas compression modules, which Bob Carroll's team had partially isolated, finally failed under the intense heat. The blast was so powerful it registered on seismographs in Norway and Scotland. It was felt in Aberdeen as a tremor. The accommodation module, already structurally compromised, collapsed into the sea. Men still trapped inside died instantly. The production deck, now warped and weakened by heat, began folding in on itself. The platform's support structure, designed to withstand North Sea storms, couldn't withstand sustained exposure to temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel loses half its strength at 700 degrees. At 1200 degrees, it loses 90%. The structural supports were well past that point. Piper Alpha was no longer a platform. It was a fragmenting inferno sinking into the North Sea. Rescue vessels continued pulling survivors from the water until nearly 3 a.m. The last survivor rescued was a galley worker named Steve Ray. He had been in the water for over 3 hours, swimming through darkness and burning oil, staying alive through sheer will. When the Silver Pit's crew pulled him aboard, he was barely conscious. His body temperature was 89 degrees, 2 degrees above the threshold for cardiac arrest. He survived, but he never fully recovered. The neurological damage from severe hypothermia left him with permanent cognitive impairment. By dawn on July 7, the scale of the disaster was clear. 167 men dead. 61 survivors. The world's most productive oil platform completely destroyed. The wreckage, still burning, would burn for another 3 weeks before the fires were finally extinguished. Lord Cullen's public inquiry began in November 1988. It would last until November 1990. Hundreds of witnesses. Thousands of documents. Every decision, every system, every choice examined in brutal detail. The permit-to-work system Bob Valentine had warned about failed exactly as he predicted. The emergency shutdown systems compromised by over 100 unauthorized modifications. The gas detection systems 43% non-functional. The firewall riddled with unsealed penetrations. The escape routes inadequate and poorly maintained. The safety culture dominated by production pressure overriding safety concerns. Occidental Petroleum faced intense scrutiny. Internal memos revealed that management had been warned repeatedly about permit systems, about emergency shutdowns, about gas detection, about structural vulnerabilities. Every warning had been documented, reviewed, and filed without action. The company eventually paid compensation, but the legal battles lasted years. Survivors fought for recognition of psychological trauma. Families fought for adequate compensation for lost providers. The amounts settled were substantial but couldn't restore what was lost. The platform was never rebuilt. The Piper field continued production through other platforms, but Piper Alpha itself remained on the ocean floor. A steel graveyard 120 miles from Aberdeen. The true cost was measured in lives destroyed. Ed Punchard suffered severe PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, panic attacks. In interviews years later, he described the psychological prison. People ask if I was brave. There was no bravery. There was just terror and survival instinct. I jumped because staying meant dying slightly slower. That's not courage. That's just mathematics. But the jump never ends. I still dream about falling. About hitting the water. About drowning in burning oil. I survived Piper Alpha, but part of me died there. Jeff Bollins returned to offshore work after 2 years. He lasted 3 months before panic attacks forced him to quit permanently. The smell of diesel fuel triggered flashbacks. The sound of metal clanging caused panic. Being enclosed in steel spaces made him hyperventilate. Charles Haggerty never worked offshore again. He became an advocate for offshore safety, speaking at industry conferences, testifying before regulatory bodies, telling his story to anyone who would listen. In a 1995 speech to the UK Health and Safety Executive, he said, 167 men died because somebody didn't check a permit. Because safety systems were designed to fail less catastrophically instead of being designed not to fail at all. Because production targets mattered more than human lives. Every single death was preventable. That's what haunts me. We didn't die from bad luck. We died from bad choices made by people who never had to face the consequences. Lord Cullen's report, published in November 1990, fundamentally changed offshore safety regulation. Not just in the North Sea. Globally. Permit-to-work systems became strictly regulated and regularly audited. Emergency shutdown systems could no longer be modified without extensive safety review. Platforms were required to have temporary refuge areas where workers could survive for hours. Evacuation training had to include scenarios where jumping might be necessary. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. The concept of safety case regulation emerged from Piper Alpha. Companies had to prove their safety systems worked. Had to demonstrate through rigorous analysis that they'd identified all major hazards and implemented adequate controls. Had to show their safety culture was real, not just documented. The change wasn't perfect. Offshore oil remained dangerous. Accidents continued. But nothing matching Piper Alpha's scale occurred in the North Sea again. In 2008, 20 years after the disaster, survivors and families gathered at the Memorial Garden in Aberdeen. 167 rose bushes. One for each man who died. Ed Punchard spoke. We didn't die because offshore oil is inherently impossible to do safely. We died because people made choices. They chose production over safety. They chose convenience over procedure. They chose to ignore warnings because acting on them would cost money or time. Bob Valentine wrote his memo about the permit system. Management filed it. Bob Carroll stayed in that control room and died trying to prevent the gas modules from exploding. The men who jumped made an impossible choice because all the safety systems that should have saved them had failed. Every death was preventable. Every single one. That's what I want people to understand. This wasn't an accident. This was a choice. Just not ours. The wind rustled the rose bushes. Each representing a man who never came home. Bob Valentine's memo, pulled from Occidental Petroleum's files during the Cullen inquiry, proved prophetic. Dated September 11, 1987. 9 months and 25 days before the disaster. The vindication he experienced watching Aberdeen's horizon turn orange was the worst kind possible. Being proven right when being wrong would have been infinitely better. A debt that came due all at once. 167 paid with their lives. 61 paid with trauma and memories they'll carry until death. And the man who warned them paid with the knowledge that he'd been right, and none of it mattered because nobody listened until it was far too late. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing. We cover disasters where institutional failure meets human tragedy. Where ignored warnings become validated in fire and death. There are more stories like this. Too many. Maybe if we learn the right lessons, we can make the list a little shorter.